She sold everything she had for a helicopter that hadn't moved in 32 years. Not a car, a helicopter. Rusted through, seized solid. The kind of wreck that serious men walk past without slowing down. The whole town thought she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But inside that broken machine, hidden behind a panel that only someone who knew what they were doing would ever find, was a tin box. And inside that box was a letter. And that letter had been waiting for years, for decades, for exactly the kind of person stubborn enough to take the whole thing apart, just to see what was left. She read it once. Then she got back to work. Some things don't need explaining. Some things just need finishing. And some people are exactly who a broken dream has been waiting for. Cassie Merritt sold her truck on a Monday. By Friday, the whole town knew. Not because she told anyone, she didn't. But Gravel Creek, Montana was the kind of place where a woman selling her only vehicle at 7 in the morning, cash deal, no haggling, meant something had either gone very wrong or very sideways. And when Pete Harmon's nephew saw her loading toolboxes into the back of a borrowed pickup 2 days later, boxes she was clearly not keeping, the whisper chain did the rest. She sold the truck. She sold the toolboxes. She sold the trailer she'd been parking behind the Merritt barn since her father died. 3 years of scraping. 3 years of taking jobs nobody else wanted. Brake jobs in the rain, engine swaps in January. One particularly miserable week rebuilding a hay baler for a rancher who paid her in frozen venison and a handshake. 3 years of that, and she had saved exactly enough money to do something that made no sense to anyone but her. She bought a helicopter. Not a working helicopter. Not even a recently broken one. A helicopter that had been sitting in a rancher's equipment shed outside Dillon since 1991. 32 years of Montana winters. 32 years of mice and rust and silence. The rancher, a barrel-chested man named Gord Feeney, had inherited it from the previous owner and never once asked what it was or where it came from. To him, it was just a thing taking up space he needed for a grain auger. He sold it to Cassie for $4,000 and seemed almost apologetic about taking her money. She didn't tell him why she wanted it. She barely knew herself. The flatbed truck came on a Tuesday morning. October. The kind of October morning where the sky is the color of old pewter and the grass has already given up pretending to be green. Cassie stood in the gravel lot behind the Merritt barn, with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and watched the driver lower the helicopter off the truck like he was setting down something fragile. It was not fragile. It was a wreck. The skids were corroded down to bare metal in spots. The fuselage had a long dent along the port side, origin unknown, that someone had attempted to fill with what appeared to be automotive body filler. The main rotor blade drooped at the tip. The tail boom had surface rust running in long orange streaks from the attachment point all the way to the tail rotor assembly, which was seized so solidly that when Cassie tried to turn it by hand the day she first saw the helicopter in Feeney's shed, it didn't move even slightly. It looked like something that had been in a crash, survived, been abandoned out of shame, and then forgotten. Cassie looked at it for a long time. Her neighbor, Doris Wakefield, had driven by twice already. Slow. The kind of slow that wasn't about the road conditions. Her mechanic, or rather her former employer, a man named Ray Stull, who ran the only other garage in Gravel Creek, had apparently heard about the purchase and told 3 people at the diner that Cassie Merritt had finally lost what was left of her mind. Cassie knew about that. Gravel Creek was not a large town. She walked forward when the flatbed driver finished his work. She placed her hand flat against the side of the fuselage, right where the rust was worst, right where the old paint was flaking away in long curling strips that revealed the dull aluminum underneath. She didn't say anything out loud. She just stood there with her hand against the metal. Then she pushed the barn doors open, and they started the slow process of getting the helicopter inside. The Merritt barn had been her father's workshop for 30 years. He'd built it himself in 1979, added to it in 1984, added to it again in 1991, when he got the contract to service farm equipment for 4 neighboring counties. At its peak, it had held 2 lifts, a full welding station, lathes, a drill press, and enough specialty tools hung on the pegboard walls to make any mechanic in the state feel either impressed or inadequate, depending on their disposition. Now it held dust. Old oil stains on the concrete floor. A few tools that hadn't been worth selling. A pegboard with the ghostly outlines of where things used to hang, the paint behind each hook still clean, the surrounding wall darker where decades of grime had settled in. And her father's radio, still plugged in, still set to the country station he'd listened to every single day of his working life. Cassie turned it on when they got the helicopter inside. Static first, then a steel guitar working its way through something slow and familiar. She didn't know the song. She knew the frequency of it, the way it filled the room without demanding anything. Her father used to hum along without realizing he was doing it. She'd told him that once, when she was maybe 12, and he'd looked genuinely surprised. "Do I?" he'd said, and then almost immediately went right back to humming. She got to work. The first 3 days were triage, figuring out what she actually had. The flight log was empty, which wasn't surprising. The registration plate on the tail gave her a tail number, N7841 Romeo, which she ran through the FAA aircraft registry and got back a registration that had lapsed in 1993. The last registered owner was listed as a company called Deacon Brothers Aviation out of Billings. The company no longer existed. She couldn't find any record of it beyond the registration. She documented everything. Photographed every panel, every seam, every corroded fastener. She started a notebook, the same kind she'd used since she was an apprentice. A simple wire-bound thing she bought 6 for $2 at the hardware store, and she wrote down every problem she found in order of severity. The list was long. It took up 11 pages. She was on page 9, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor beneath the tail boom, with a flashlight in her teeth and a mirror on a stick angled up into the tail rotor gearbox housing, when she heard the knock. 3 taps. Short. Then nothing. She pulled the mirror out, killed the flashlight, and sat still for a moment. It was past 10 at night. She wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody in Gravel Creek dropped by the Merritt barn at 10 at night because nobody in Gravel Creek had a reason to. She got up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and opened the barn door about 8 inches. The man standing outside was in his late 60s. Tall, lean in the way of men who had done physical work their whole lives. White hair cropped short. A canvas coat with the collar turned up against the cold. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes had gone directly to the helicopter the moment the door opened, and they stayed there completely still, the way a person looks at something they thought they'd never see again. "Help you?" Cassie said. He didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at the helicopter. Then he seemed to remember where he was. "Sorry," he said. His voice was low, a little rough. "I saw the light. I've been driving past this place every night for a week trying to decide if I was going to stop. And tonight you stopped." He looked at her then. Clear gray eyes. "Not unkind, my name is Walt Deacon. I think I know that aircraft." Cassie opened the door the rest of the way. His name was Walt Deacon, and he was 67 years old, and he had grown up in Billings, and spent most of his adult life as a heavy equipment mechanic, and he had a brother named Roy who was 4 years younger than him, and who had been, by any reasonable measure, one of the most naturally gifted mechanical minds Walt had ever encountered. He said all of this sitting on an overturned crate near the barn door, speaking slowly and carefully the way people speak when they're managing something large by keeping their voice very quiet. Roy had started building the helicopter in 1988, not from a kit, not from a set of commercially available plans, from his own head, mostly, supplemented by technical references he ordered through interlibrary loan from the University Library in Missoula, supplemented further by an aeronautical engineering textbook he'd found at an estate sale, and annotated so thoroughly that by the end there was more Roy in the margins than there was original author on the page. He worked on it for 3 years, Walt said, in a shop we rented over near the Billings airfield. I helped when I could. I'm a mechanic, not an engineer. I could tell he knew what he was doing, but I couldn't always follow the reasoning. "What was the company?" Cassie asked. "Deacon Brothers Aviation." Walt smiled. It was not entirely a happy smile. That was Roy's idea. He thought if we gave it a proper name it would seem more serious, more real. He paused. It was real. He just needed it to feel that way. What happened to it? He submitted a design proposal to the FAA in 1990 for a modified tail rotor linkage system. His own design. It reduced control input lag in high crosswind conditions by changing the geometry of the linkage rather than adding mechanical complexity. Walt stopped. "I'm simplifying. I understand linkage geometry, Cassie said. He looked at her, recalibrated slightly. The FAA rejected the proposal, not because it was wrong, because it was experimental and they didn't have adequate testing protocols for rotorcraft of this configuration at the time. They weren't wrong either, technically. They just said no, and that was that. And Roy? Walt was quiet for a moment. He finished the aircraft anyway. He called her Iron Moth. He got her to the point where she could theoretically fly. But without certification, she couldn't be tested legally. And without testing, she couldn't be certified. He went around in that circle for a year, trying to find a way through, and eventually Walt stopped again. He ran out of road. He quit. He stopped. There's a difference, I think. Though I'm not sure Roy ever believed that. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a leather folder, old and soft with handling, and held it out to Cassie. She took it and opened it. Inside was a flight log, the pages yellowed at the edges, filled with Roy's handwriting. Detailed, methodical. The entries stopped in March of 1991. Behind the flight log was a folded set of papers. She opened them. Technical drawings. Precise and confident lines. Clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing, with dense handwritten annotations crowding every margin. The tail rotor linkage design. She could see immediately what he was after. The geometry was unconventional. Elegant, actually, in the way that good engineering often looked simple, until you thought about it hard enough to realize how much difficulty was hidden in that simplicity. She sat there in the cold barn looking at Roy Deacon's drawings for a long time. Walt watched her. He didn't say anything. "These are good," Cassie finally said. "I know. Really good. I know that too." She looked up. "How'd the helicopter end up in Feeney's shed in Dillon?" Walt looked at his hands. "Roy sold it in 1993. He needed the money, and I think he needed it gone. He sold it to a man who had ideas about restoring it, and that man sold it to another man. And somewhere along the way it ended up with Feeney, who I suspect had no idea what he had." He paused. "I didn't know where it was. I didn't look. I think I was afraid of what it would mean, finding it. Whether it was already gone, or whether it was still out there waiting. And then I bought it. And then you bought it. And someone saw the tail number in the county registration and mentioned it at a bar. And a woman who knows my daughter told her, and my daughter told me." He shook his head slightly. "Small states." Cassie looked at the drawings again. He never tried to resubmit when the FAA updated their protocols. Walt was quiet for just a moment too long. Then Roy got sick, Parkinson's. He was diagnosed in 2017. He passed in September of 2019. He said it plainly, but the plainness cost him something. He'd been working on something in his last couple of years, rewriting the design specifications from memory. His hands weren't steady enough for precise drawing by then, but his mind was still. Walt stopped, cleared his throat. His mind was sharp until near the end. Cassie closed the folder carefully and held it out to him. Walt shook his head. "Keep it, please. That's why I'm here." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that she recognized, not grief exactly, though there was grief in it, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally found somewhere to set it down. "Okay," she said. She stayed up until 3 in the morning, reading the flight log and the technical drawings by lamplight. The radio played on in the background, quiet and crackling. She read Roy Deacon's notes the way she read anything technical, slowly and twice, but she kept finding herself slowing down further than that, caught not just by the engineering, which was impressive, but by the voice of it. Roy had written his annotations in the margins of the drawings in a way that was conversational, occasionally impatient with himself, sometimes quietly delighted when something worked out the way he'd hoped. There was a note in the upper corner of the third page that read, "Linkage test on bench confirms theory. Geometry holds. Why couldn't I see this 2 years ago? Would have saved so much time. Answer: because 2 years ago I wasn't ready." She didn't know anything about Roy Deacon except what Walt had told her. But by 3 in the morning she felt like she knew something about the way his mind worked. And she respected it. Not uncritically. There were a few places where she would have made different choices. One place where she was fairly sure he'd made an error in his load calculations that was small enough not to matter at low altitude, but might become significant in certain crosswind conditions at altitude. She marked it with a small question mark in pencil. Her notebook. She didn't write in his drawings. In the morning, she made coffee from the tin she kept in the barn, the same tin her father had always kept there, and she drank it standing up looking at iron moth in the early light that came through the gaps in the barn siding. The helicopter looked different in the morning. Or maybe she was looking at it differently. The same rust, the same dent in the fuselage, the same seized tail rotor. But now she knew what it had been trying to be. She knew whose hands had shaped it and why and what it had cost him. She drank the rest of her coffee. Then she picked up her notebook and her keys. She drove 2 hours south. Pete Harmon had retired from fabrication work 4 years ago after 40 years of cutting, bending and welding metal for anyone in the region who needed something done precisely and without complaint. He was 64 years old. He lived on a small property outside of Dillon with 2 dogs, a wood stove, and a machine shop in his garage that was better equipped than most commercial operations Cassie had been in. He didn't use it much anymore, he said, but he kept it up because letting good machinery sit idle was a kind of sin he didn't care to have on his conscience. He'd known Cassie's father. He'd known Cassie since she was 16 and came to him to learn stick welding because her father was too impatient to teach her himself. Pete had been a better teacher than her father in that respect. More systematic. Less likely to take the electrode out of her hand and just do it himself. He was splitting firewood when she pulled in. He stopped, set his maul down, and looked at the drawing she spread on the hood of her truck the way a man looks at something that requires his full attention. He didn't speak for a long time. He turned the pages. He went back to the first page. He went forward again. Tail rotor linkage, he said. His own design. He turned another page. What's wrong with the existing one? Seized solid. And even if I freed it up, the geometry's stock. His design is better. Pete looked at her over the drawings. You're going to rebuild this to his specification. Yes. Has anyone told you that's complicated? Several people, yes. Has that information changed your plans? No. Pete looked back at the drawings. He was quiet again. Then there's a load calculation on page 3 that's going to give you trouble above a certain altitude. Cassie blinked. She'd found the same thing at 2 in the morning. It had taken her significantly longer than the time Pete had spent looking at it. I know. You'll need to compensate. I know that too. He picked up the drawings and tapped them against the hood to align the pages. This is complicated and it might not work, and if it does work, it's still going to take you a very long time and a significant amount of precision fabrication that I assume you want me to help with. I was hoping you'd say yes. I'm going to say yes, but if that thing goes sideways, you don't mention my name. Cassie smiled for the first time in about 2 days. Deal. She drove home with a list of materials Pete was going to source, and a timeline that was ambitious and a feeling in her chest that was unfamiliar enough that it took her most of the drive to identify it. Purpose. Not the day-to-day kind. Not the kind that came from having a job to do. The other kind. The kind that made the day-to-day feel like it was pointing at something. The next morning, a Tuesday, she arrived at the barn at 6 and found someone sitting on the front steps. 17 years old. Maybe. Hard to say. Skinny in the angular way of boys who have recently grown faster than they'd expected to and haven't quite caught up yet. A welding helmet, old mod, probably bought second-hand, sitting on his knee, too large for his head. He had the look of someone who had been sitting there for a while and had spent the waiting time deciding not to leave. When Cassie pulled up, he stood immediately. Too fast. The welding helmet fell off his knee and he caught it before it hit the steps in a scrambling grab that was more successful than it should have been. I'm Danny Pruitt, he said. I heard you're rebuilding a helicopter. Cassie got out of her truck. Where'd you hear that? Mrs. Wakefield told my mom. My mom told me. He paused. Also Pete Harmon told his neighbor. And his neighbor told my uncle, and my uncle told my dad, and my dad told me. Small state, yes ma'am. He was holding the welding helmet with both hands now, looking at her steadily like he'd rehearsed being looked at. I want to learn. I don't know much yet, but I'm good at following instructions and I work hard and I don't complain. Cassie looked at him for a moment. Then she walked past him to the barn door. I haven't said yes yet, she said. I know. She got the door open, went inside, came back out with a push broom. She held it out to him. He took it, looked at her. This is where I start. This is where you start. He took the broom inside and started sweeping without another word. Cassie stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. He swept methodically, starting at the far end of the barn and working toward the door, moving around the base of the helicopter carefully, not touching anything he hadn't been told he could touch. She went to work. He showed up every morning after that, sometimes before her. He swept. He organized. He handed tools when asked. He learned the difference between handing a tool and handing the right tool without being asked, which took him 3 days. On the 4th day, she started explaining what she was doing as she worked, not because she'd planned to, but because he asked good questions. Quiet questions, the kind that showed he'd been paying attention. She told herself she wasn't teaching him. She was thinking out loud. There was a difference. The town found its way to the barn the same way it always did in small places, through proximity and curiosity, and the fundamental human need to be part of something that feels like it might matter. The hardware store owner, a compact and talkative man named Burl Higgins, arrived on the 5th day with a box of aviation-grade fasteners he'd ordered in from a supplier, just in case, he said, she might find a use for them. She didn't ask him how he knew what grade she'd need. She suspected Pete had made a phone call. The woman who ran the county agricultural library dropped off a stack of technical manuals on rotorcraft mechanics. The note attached said only, "Thought you might want these." Cassie already had better sources, but she put them on the shelf and didn't say so. On the 9th day, she found a covered dish on the barn steps. Beef stew, still warm, no note. She ate it for lunch. It was the best thing she'd eaten in a week, because she'd been forgetting to eat properly, which she knew and had been telling herself to address and had not yet addressed. On the 12th night, she found the box. She'd been working on the inner structure of the cockpit, removing panels to assess the condition of the frame behind them, checking for corrosion, for stress fractures, for the things that didn't show from outside. She was on the port side, behind the pilot's position, removing a section of aluminum interior paneling that had been riveted in place and required a specific sequence of fastener removal to come off without warping. She got the panel free and set it aside, shone her light into the space behind it. There was a tin box, about the size of a hardback book. It had been mounted to the structural frame with 2 small brackets, the kind of careful, deliberate installation that didn't happen by accident, that took forethought and intention and a clear idea of exactly what you were doing and why. She sat with the box in her lap for a moment before she opened it. Inside, an envelope, sealed with tape that had dried out and lost most of its grip. A compass. Brass, old style, the kind with the rotating bezel and the needle housed in oil. The face was engraved on the back RD. And a small metal tag, the kind used for equipment identification, stamped with a 10-digit GPS coordinate. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was handwritten on 3 sheets of plain paper, the handwriting different from the precise technical script she'd seen in the drawings. This was smaller, less certain. The hand of someone who was working against a tremor, but was determined not to let it stop them. If you found this, then you took Iron Moth apart the right way. That means you know what you're doing. It means you care enough to do it properly. I don't know who you are, but I think I know something about you already. This aircraft was not built to be a record. It was not built to prove a point or win an argument with a regulatory agency, though it may have started out that way. It was built because I needed to build something that could get me somewhere. I couldn't figure out how to get any other way. And then I couldn't finish it. And then it was too late. And then it wasn't mine anymore. If you're reading this, it's yours. The coordinates on the tag go there. When Iron Moth flies, take her there. I left something at that location that needs to be returned. I'm not able to tell you what it is or to whom. You'll understand when you arrive. One more thing, the tail rotor linkage. The modified design is right. The FAA was wrong to reject it. Or rather, they weren't wrong. They were cautious, which is not the same thing, but the result was the same. The design works. I know it works because I tested the geometry on a bench rig for 6 months before I ever put it in the aircraft. If you found someone who can fabricate it properly and you trust your own judgment, trust it. Don't let caution become the same thing as giving up. Fly safe. Fly true. Finish what I couldn't. Roy Deacon Cassie sat on the concrete floor of the barn for a very long time after she read that. The radio was playing. Something old, something quiet. The lamp she'd hung from the ceiling made the helicopter's aluminum skeleton look almost warm. She read the letter again. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her shirt pocket. She put the compass and the metal tag in her jacket pocket. She got up, got a length of wire from the workbench, bent it into a hook and hung the envelope on the wall next to the technical drawings, next to the flight log. Then she opened her notebook to the current page and wrote the 10-digit coordinate in the margin. Underneath it she wrote one word: someday. She stood there looking at it. Then she went back to work. The days found their rhythm after that. Early mornings, Cassie alone with the aircraft and the radio. Mid-morning, Danny arriving, taking up his position at the edge of whatever she was doing, handing tools, asking his quiet questions. Afternoons, Pete driving up twice a week with fabricated components wrapped in shop cloth. Evenings, the occasional appearance of someone from town with something useful, or something edible, or sometimes both. Walt Deacon came on Saturdays. He didn't help with the mechanical work. He wasn't there for that. He sat in the old folding chair near the barn door and he talked, sometimes about Roy, sometimes about the early days of the build in the Billings shop, sometimes about nothing in particular. Cassie worked while he talked. Danny listened. The radio played underneath it all. Walt told her about the test rig Roy had built for the linkage system. How he'd spent 6 months running it through every stress scenario he could design before he was satisfied. How he'd written his FAA proposal in 3 drafts, each one more technically comprehensive than the last, trying to anticipate every objection. How the rejection letter had been 8 sentences long and had not addressed a single technical point he'd raised. He didn't get angry, Walt said. That was almost worse. He just got quiet. Roy was never quiet. He was always talking, always thinking out loud. After the letter, he just stopped. Cassie set down her wrench. For how long? Weeks. Then he started coming back to the shop. Working. But different. Less. Walt paused. Less like himself. Like he was going through the motions to see if the feeling would come back. Did it? Walt looked at the helicopter for a while. When he was close to finished, in 1990, 1991, he got some of it back. He had something he was working toward. Someone he was. He stopped. Cassie looked at him. He shook his head slightly. Not ready. Or not the right time. He finished her, Walt said, as far as he could take it without being able to fly her. Then the road ran out. Danny was quiet through all of this. He was learning something from these conversations that wasn't in any technical manual. Cassie could see him filing it away. The nights were cold now. She'd brought a space heater from the house, the industrial kind, and it knocked back the worst of it without making the barn warm exactly, just less hostile. She worked later than she should have. She slept less than was strictly wise. She did not read Roy's letter again. She didn't need to. It was in her head now, all of it, and she found herself returning to specific lines at specific moments. Don't let caution become the same thing as giving up. She thought about that one when she was removing the corroded main rotor hub assembly, and the 4th fastener in a row stripped, and she sat back on her heels and stared at the ceiling for a minute. She thought about the coordinates at odd times. Lying in bed, driving to the hardware store. She didn't know what they led to. She'd looked them up once just to see the location on a map. A field about 12 miles east of Gravel Creek. She knew roughly whose land that was, though she wasn't certain. She'd looked at it on the satellite image for a long time without learning anything. She thought about what it meant that Roy had hidden the box where he'd hidden it. Not in the cockpit. Not under a seat. In the interior wall, behind a panel that required care and knowledge to remove without damage. He'd put it somewhere that only someone who knew what they were doing would find it. Someone who took the time to do it right. It was a test, she thought. Not a cruel one. Just a filter. He wanted to know. Or he wanted to know from beyond wherever he was now, that the person who found it was the right kind of person to trust with what came next. She didn't know if she was the right kind of person. She knew she was a competent mechanic. She knew she was stubborn in ways that had cost her things over the years, and also preserved things over the years, and whether that was a quality or a defect depended heavily on the situation. She knew she didn't walk away from things, even things that walked away from her. Maybe that was enough. On the last Friday of October, at 7 in the evening, a white SUV with government plates pulled slowly down the road past the barn. It didn't stop, it just slowed. She saw it through the gap in the barn door where the light spilled out into the darkening lot. It went past, kept going. She watched it until she couldn't see it anymore. Then she went back to work. The white SUV came back on a Monday morning, 7:45. Cassie was under the tail boom with a wire brush and a can of rust converter, working through the surface corrosion methodically, section by section, the way her father had taught her. Start at the worst spot. Work outward. Don't skip anything because it looks minor. She heard the gravel, heard the engine cut, heard one door open and close with the specific solid thunk of a government vehicle. She didn't come out from under the tail boom, footsteps across the gravel, into the barn. A pause. The particular quality of silence that meant someone was looking at something and assessing it. Ms. Merritt. She came out, stood up. The man was about her height, early 50s, gray suit that had been pressed that morning and would not need pressing again for several days. He had a clipboard. Of course he had a clipboard. He was wearing mirrored sunglasses inside a barn in October, which she noted and filed away under things that told you something about a person. Dale Hurst, he said. FAA. Flight Standards District Office out of Helena. I know who you are, Cassie said, which was not entirely true. She hadn't known his name. But she'd known what the plates meant, and she'd known this was coming, had known it since the SUV did its slow pass Friday evening, and she'd spent the weekend deciding how she was going to handle it. Calm, factual. Don't apologize for anything you haven't done wrong. Hurst walked around Iron Moth without being invited to. He moved with the methodical patience of someone who had done this many times, tapping on the fuselage here and there, crouching to look at the skid attachment points, peering into the cockpit without touching the door. Danny had arrived 20 minutes earlier and was standing near the workbench, very still, in the particular way of a 17-year-old boy who has realized that being invisible might be strategically useful. Hurst spent 40 minutes on the exterior, then another 20 on the tail section. Then he came back to where Cassie was standing and took off the sunglasses and put them in his breast pocket. This aircraft, he said, is registered as lapsed since 1993. It appears to have significant non-standard modifications to the tail rotor control system, or rather modifications that were never certified. He looked at his clipboard. Are you the owner of record? I purchased it from Gordon Feeney and Dillon 6 weeks ago, and the modifications. They were part of the original build. The aircraft was designed and constructed by a private individual, Roy Deacon. The tail rotor linkage system is his own design. The technical documentation is here. She held out the folder, Roy's drawings, his specifications, his 6 months of bench testing data. Hurst took the folder, looked through it. His face didn't change much. It was a face that had practice not changing. You've been performing restoration work on the aircraft. I've been performing assessment and preliminary disassembly. I haven't powered any system. I haven't attempted flight. Have you been performing work on the non-certified modified components? A pause. I've assessed them. Hurst closed the folder, looked at her. Miss Merritt. This aircraft cannot be operated, tested, or have restoration work performed on its modified components without experimental aircraft certification. You need to file a Form 8130-12 with the Flight Standards Office, undergo designated airworthiness representative review, and complete a minimum of 400 hours of documented ground testing before any flight testing can occur. He handed the folder back. Until that process is complete, this aircraft is grounded. Any work that constitutes alteration or repair of uncertified components is prohibited. Cassie took the folder. How long does that process take? Typically 8 to 14 months, depending on workload and the complexity of the review. She didn't say anything. I understand that's not what you want to hear, Hurst said. He said it in the tone of a man who had said it many times and was not particularly troubled by the saying. He wrote something on his clipboard, tore off a copy and handed it to her. Then he put his sunglasses back on, picked up his case, and walked back out to the SUV. Cassie stood there holding the paper. Danny cleared his throat from near the workbench. She turned to look at him. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who wants to say something useful and hasn't found what that is yet. Okay, Cassie said. She folded the paper and put it in her back pocket. Get the broom. He got the broom. She went to the workbench, spread Roy's drawings flat, looked at them without touching them, thought about 14 months, thought about the barn lease, Thought about the $4,000 she'd spent on Iron Moth, and the other $3,000 she'd spent since on materials and tools and Pete's fabrication work, and the roughly $2,000 she had left in her account. Thought about Roy's letter. Don't let caution become the same thing as giving up. 14 months was not giving up. 14 months was a problem that needed a solution. She picked up her phone and called Walt. He answered on the second ring. She told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. I know someone, he said. Or I knew someone. I don't know if he's still practicing. Who? His name is Gus Aldridge. He worked FAA flight standards for 30 years. Retired about 6 years ago. He was a designated airworthiness representative for most of his career. Specialized in experimental rotorcraft. A pause. He and Roy corresponded back in 1990. Roy reached out to every DR he could find, trying to get someone to review the design. Most of them said no. Gus wrote back. He said the design had merit, but the documentation wasn't sufficient for the review process at that time. He wasn't unkind about it. Cassie looked at Iron Moth. Would he remember? I don't know, but I have his last address. 2 days later, Walt made the drive to Wyoming. He came back alone. He sat in the barn for a while before he said anything, and Cassie didn't push him. She could tell from the way he carried himself that the trip had been heavier than the errand. He's alive, Walt said. Still sharp. He has a shop on his property, still maintains his DR certification. Just barely, just enough to keep it active. He says he doesn't know why. Habit, maybe. Will he help? He said he'd drive up. Walt looked at his hands. He said he remembered Roy's proposal. Said he'd thought about it over the years, whether he'd made the right call. He paused. He said yes. Gus Aldridge arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a truck that was about 15 years old and had clearly been used for the purposes trucks were designed for. He was a compact man, not short but somehow contained, like he took up exactly the amount of space he intended to take up and no more. White hair. A calm, deliberate way of moving that reminded Cassie of the way very experienced surgeons moved. She'd seen one on a television program once. No wasted motion. Everything considered before it happened. He walked around Iron Moth for 20 minutes without saying anything. He looked at Roy's drawings for another 10. He asked Cassie 4 technical questions, all of them precise, none of them answerable with anything other than a precise answer. Then he set the drawings down. I remember this design, he said. I told Roy Deacon in 1990 that it had merit but insufficient documentation. That was accurate. What I didn't tell him, because it wasn't my place, and because I wasn't sure myself, was that I thought it was probably right. The geometry. The approach. He looked at the tail section of Iron Moth. I've thought about it since. I've seen other approaches to the same problem in the 30 years since, and none of them were as clean. Cassie was very still. There's a load calculation issue on page 3, Gus said. You've already marked it. She had. In pencil. The same small question mark she'd made at 2 a.m, the first night she'd read the drawings. Yes. It's manageable. It'll require recalculation and some component adjustment. He looked at her. If I take this on as DR, it's my name on the documentation. My certification on the line. I'm going to need to be satisfied at every stage, not just the final product. That means access. That means no shortcuts. And that means the 400 hours gets done properly, not on paper. Understood. The certification process will still take time. 8 months minimum, realistically. Possibly longer. I'll do everything I can on my end to move it forward, but I can't control the review queue at the district office. 8 months, Cassie said. That's better than 14. It's still 8 months. I know what 8 months is. She looked at him. Will you do it? Gus was quiet for a moment. Then, I told Roy Deacon no in 1990 because the paperwork wasn't right. I've spent 30 years wondering if that was the real reason. He picked up the drawings. Yes, I'll do it. That was the afternoon things shifted. The problem was that while Gus said yes on Thursday, on Friday Cassie found out who had said something to the FAA. It wasn't complicated to trace. Gravel Creek was a small town. Someone had called the Flight Standards District Office in Helena and reported an unregistered experimental aircraft being restored with uncertified modifications at the Merritt property. The call had come in on a Wednesday, which was 3 days after Doris Wakefield had mentioned to someone at the diner that Cassie was working on something unusual in her barn. The someone at the diner was not Doris's fault. Doris was a talker, not a schemer. The someone at the diner had passed it to someone else, and that chain ended, without much surprise to anyone who knew the territory, at Ray Stull. Ray Stull ran the only other full-service garage in Gravel Creek. He had, 3 years ago, when Cassie's father's health declined and the Merritt Shop's contracts began to slip, quietly and efficiently absorbed most of those contracts into his own operation. Not illegally, not even unkindly in a technical sense. He'd just been there, ready when the gap opened. That was how Ray Stull operated. He was always ready when a gap opened. He was 55. He had the kind of face that was pleasant and unremarkable, in the way that made it hard to remember what you'd thought of it 5 minutes after you stopped looking at it. He sat on the Gravel Creek Town Council. He was a deacon at the Methodist Church on Birch Street. He coached youth soccer in the fall. He called the FAA. Cassie knew this the way you know things in small towns, through the accumulation of small confirming details that don't individually prove anything but together form a shape too specific to be coincidence. She wasn't angry, not exactly. She was something colder than angry. She drove to his garage on a Friday afternoon, walked in. Ray was behind the counter. He looked at her and his expression settled into something careful and mild. "Cassie." "Ray, what can I do for you?" She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. Neither of them was in a hurry. "Did you call the FAA?" she said. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Then I have responsibilities to this community. If someone's operating unsafe equipment near residential, I'm not operating anything. It's sitting in a barn. Experimental aircraft. Modified components. I think it's reasonable to." "You think it's reasonable," Cassie said. Flat, not a question. Ray's expression didn't change much. "I think there are processes for a reason. And I think it's not unreasonable for someone with concerns to make sure those processes are being followed." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and walked out. That was it. No scene. No raised voices. She'd known before she went in that there was nothing to be gained by anger. She went because she needed to see his face when she asked the question. She needed to know if it was what she thought it was, or something smaller. It was exactly what she thought it was. He'd seen an opportunity to create a problem for her, and he'd taken it. Not out of malice exactly. Out of the particular territorial instinct of a man who'd gotten comfortable being the only option, and didn't want a competing option to stabilize. She drove back to the barn, went inside, stood in front of Iron Moth for a minute. Then she got back to work. Walt was there that Saturday, as always, with his coffee and his chair. He didn't ask about Ray Stull. Cassie thought he probably knew. Danny was quieter than usual. He was learning to read the room, which was one of the more useful things he'd learned since he started showing up. Walt was telling some story about Roy from the early days of the build, something about a calculation error that had sent Roy to the library 3 times in 1 week, when the barn door opened and a woman walked in. She walked in like she'd been there before, which, as it turned out, was not entirely inaccurate. Late 50s. Silver-streaked hair cut practically, not fashionably. A fleece jacket over a flannel shirt. The particular kind of outdoors tan that came from living and working on land, not from recreational exposure. She moved without hurry. She looked at the helicopter the way Walt had looked at it the first night. Like she'd been carrying the image of it for a long time and was now overlaying the real thing on top of the carried image to see how they matched. Walt went very still in his folding chair. The woman placed her hand on the fuselage of Iron Moth. Flat, steady. She didn't look at anyone in the barn. She looked at the helicopter. "I heard she still had breath left in her," she said. Her name was Helen Voss. She was 58 years old. She owned 140 acres of farmland about 12 miles east of Gravel Creek, land she'd inherited from her parents and worked herself for 30 years, land she had never sold and never intended to sell. She sat in the second folding chair Walt brought from the corner, and she told Cassie what Cassie needed to know and what Walt had apparently not been ready to say. Roy Deacon had built Iron Moth, at least in part, because of Helen Voss. She said it plainly, not dramatically, not like a confession, like a fact she'd had a long time to make peace with. "He flew over my family's land in a crop duster in 1987. I was out in the south field. I looked up. He looked down." She paused. "He found out who I was. We wrote letters for 2 years. Real letters, the paper kind. She stopped, looked at her hands. He was the kind of person who put everything into words. He wasn't like that in person, Walt can tell you, but in writing he said things most people never manage to say out loud. Walt very quietly said, "That's true. He told me about Iron Moth. He told me he was building it so he could land it in my south field. So he could show up the way you couldn't show up in a car or a truck, so it would mean something different." Helen looked at the helicopter. He finished it, or almost finished it, and then the FAA said no, and then he went quiet. The letters kept coming, but they were different. Less of him in them. She folded her hands in her lap, and then they stopped. The barn was very quiet. "He didn't tell you he was going to stop," Cassie said. "No. He just stopped." Helen's voice was steady, but there was a kind of control in the steadiness that suggested what it was containing. "I wrote to him twice after. He didn't answer. I thought..." She stopped. Started again. "I thought he'd decided. I thought it was his way of deciding." Walt leaned forward slightly in his chair. There was something in his face that Cassie recognized now as the expression of a man who has been holding a piece of information and is deciding whether the time has finally come to put it down. "Tell her," Cassie said. Not unkindly, but she'd known Walt for 6 weeks now, and she knew what that expression meant. Walt looked at Helen for a long moment. Then, "Roy thought you'd moved. He got it into his head, I don't know from where, that you'd sold the land and left. Someone told him, or he thought someone told him. I was never sure of the details. By the time I found out he believed it, he was already..." Walt stopped. "He was already past the point where correcting it would have helped him, I thought. I was wrong about that. I know that now." He looked at his coffee cup. "I should have told him. I didn't." And then he was gone. The silence in the barn lasted long enough to have weight. Helen Voss was looking at Walt. Walt was looking at the floor. Danny had stopped pretending to organize things at the workbench and was just standing there, very still, understanding that the thing happening in the room was not something he should interrupt. "He thought I'd left," Helen said. "Yes. So he stopped writing because he thought I was already gone." "Yes." She nodded slowly once, processing it, filing it somewhere that would take time to sort out. Then she reached into the pocket of her fleece jacket and took out an envelope and held it out to Cassie. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, slightly overexposed in the way of photos taken in bright outdoor light. A man, maybe late 30s, standing beside the nose of Iron Moth when the helicopter was new and complete and not yet broken by time. He was smiling. Not the careful smile of someone who knows they're being photographed. The other kind. The kind that happens when a person is standing inside a moment they've been working toward for years and can't quite believe they've arrived. On the back of the photograph, in a handwriting Cassie didn't recognize, "She was always meant to fly." Cassie turned the photograph over, looked at Roy Deacon's face. Then she put it back in the envelope, walked to the workbench, and pinned it to the wall next to Roy's letter. She stood back and looked at the two things side by side. "All right," she said. "To no one in particular. Or to all of them. Let's get back to it." The following Monday, Ray still escalated. He brought it to the town council. Not formally, not at first. He mentioned it to 3 council members in a conversation that happened to occur at the hardware store parking lot on a Tuesday morning. He mentioned fire risk. He mentioned the proximity of the Merritt barn to 3 neighboring properties. He mentioned the words experimental aircraft and uncertified modifications twice each in a 5-minute span. By Thursday there was a letter. Official town council stationery. It cited Section 14.3 of the County Property Use Ordinance, a clause about structures housing potentially hazardous materials or operations. It requested that Cassie appear before the council at the next scheduled meeting, 2 weeks out, to demonstrate compliance with the relevant safety standards, or provide a timeline for relocating the operation. She read the letter twice. Then she put it with the FAA notice in the folder she'd started keeping for things she needed to address and couldn't do anything about immediately. The same week, a woman named Brenda Colt drove up from Denver. She arrived in a leased sedan and wore a blazer over a turtleneck and carried a leather portfolio that she set on the workbench without asking. She was 49. She worked for an organization that dealt in historic aviation preservation, she said. She'd heard about Iron Moth from someone who'd heard about it from someone else, which was a description that applied to most of the things that happened in Cassie's life currently. She circled the helicopter with the assessing look of someone who was calculating value. "Do you know how rare this is?" Brenda said. "A surviving example of private experimental rotorcraft from this period. Intact. Original structure. The modifications alone would be of significant historical interest. She's not historical, Cassie said. She's current. Brenda looked at her. You're going to try to fly it. I'm going to fly it. Do you have any idea what the certification process? Yes. 8 months minimum. I have a DAR. I have the documentation. I have the 400 hours. Cassie looked at her. What's your offer? Brenda opened the portfolio, slid a single sheet across the workbench. Cassie looked at it. $85,000. A preservation partnership agreement. Iron Moth would be fully restored, displayed in climate-controlled conditions, properly attributed, with full documentation of Roy Deacon's design work included in the exhibition. She'd be in a case, under lights, behind rope. Cassie picked up the sheet and handed it back. No, she said. Brenda took the sheet. She looked at Cassie for a moment with an expression that mixed genuine puzzlement with something close to admiration. Can I ask why? You said she'd be displayed. Cassie looked at Iron Moth. She's not for display. Then what is she for? To fly. Brenda put the sheet back in the portfolio. She picked it up. She stood there for a moment looking at the helicopter. Then she looked at Cassie again, nodded once, as if answering a question she'd asked herself internally, and left. Danny watched her car pull out of the lot. $85,000, he said.
Yes.
That's a lot of money.
Yes.
He thought about it for a second. You didn't even hesitate. Cassie picked up her wrench. No. He thought about that too. Then he went back to what he'd been doing. Cassie could tell from the set of his shoulders that he was filing the moment away. Adding it to the other moments he'd been filing away since he first walked in with his second-hand welding helmet and asked if he could help. She hoped he'd find a use for all of them eventually. Walt's chest pain came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Helen's first visit. He'd been in the barn for an hour, telling a story about the time. Roy ordered an obscure German engineering reference through interlibrary loan, and it arrived annotated in pencil by someone who'd had it before, and whose marginal notes were, Roy felt, completely wrong about several important points, and this had consumed Roy for a week, when Walt stopped mid-sentence. He put his hand on his sternum. Not dramatically. Just placed it there, like he was checking something. Cassie was at his side in about 3 seconds. I'm fine, he said. You stopped talking, she said. You never stop talking. I'm fine, he said again. But he let her take his arm when she offered it, which told her more than his words did. She drove him to the regional hospital in her borrowed truck, Danny in the back seat, nobody talking. The intake nurses took Walt back within 10 minutes, which was either a good sign about the efficiency of the system or a less good sign about what they saw when they looked at him. Cassie and Danny sat in the waiting room for 2 hours. Danny found a magazine from 4 months ago and read it cover to cover without appearing to register any of it. Cassie stared at the wall and thought about 8 months and 400 hours, and barn lease deadlines and Gus's comment about the load calculation, and the photograph of Roy on the workbench wall and the coordinates in her notebook and the one word she'd written under them. Someday. A doctor came out at noon and told them Walt had experienced a cardiac event. Moderate. Not catastrophic. He would need to stay for observation. He would need medication adjustments. He would need to take things more carefully going forward. He was stable. He was awake. He was, according to the nurse who'd been in the room with him, complaining about the quality of the coffee. Cassie exhaled. Danny put down the 4-month-old magazine. She was allowed to see Walt for 10 minutes. He was in a bed with too many monitors attached and a look on his face that was somewhere between irritated and chastened, the expression of a man who was annoyed at his own body for making a scene. I'm fine, he said. You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it. She sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at her. Don't stop, he said. Whatever you're thinking, don't stop. She didn't answer that. He reached into the pocket of the jacket folded on the bedside chair, the one he'd been wearing when she drove him over. He pulled out an envelope, creased, thin. He held it out to her. She looked at it. Don't open it unless you're going to quit, he said. If you're not going to quit, you don't need what's in it. He paused. And if you are going to quit, what's in it will probably change your mind. So it amounts to the same thing either way. She took the envelope, put it in her jacket pocket. I'll be back in the barn in a week, Walt said. 2 weeks. 1.5, she looked at him. Don't negotiate with me right now. He almost smiled. Almost. There was something behind it that wasn't quite a smile. Something that looked like a man who had something he still needed to see happen. She drove back to Gravel Creek, dropped Danny at his house, sat in the truck in the barn lot for a few minutes. The envelope was in her jacket pocket. She could feel the weight of it, though it was light. Paper weight. The weight of a thing that isn't heavy until it is. She didn't open it. She got out of the truck, pushed the barn door open, turned on the lamp, turned on the radio. Static. Then something slow and steel-stringed finding its way through. Iron Moth stood in the middle of the barn, incomplete and patient, the way it had been standing since she brought it here 6 weeks ago. She picked up her notebook, opened it to the page with the coordinates, looked at the words she'd written underneath. Someday. Then she picked up her tools and got back to work. November came in hard that year, the kind of November that Montana saved for people who'd gotten comfortable. Wind off the Rockies with actual teeth in it. Mornings where the thermometer outside the barn door read things that made a reasonable person reconsider their life choices. Cassie was not a reasonable person. Or rather, she was reasonable about everything except this. She was in the barn by 5:30 every morning. Sometimes 5. Once, memorably, at 4:15 because she'd woken up thinking about the tail rotor gearbox and couldn't find her way back to sleep. Danny arrived at 7. Gus came 4 days a week, driving up from Wyoming in his 15-year-old truck, arriving without announcement, setting his thermos on the workbench, and getting to work with the calm efficiency of a man who had spent decades doing exactly what needed doing and had no patience for anything that wasn't that. The checklist was long. 400 hours of documented ground testing, each hour logged and signed, each system verified against the FAA Order 8130.2 criteria Gus had memorized over 30 years of applying them. Rotor tension, oil pressure, avionics routing, vibration damping through the full range of simulated load conditions, fuel system integrity, control response calibration, each item checked, recorded, signed. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening. Like a woman and an old man and a teenager were standing around a helicopter doing paperwork. But what was actually happening was this. Gus Aldridge was rebuilding his own certainty, item by item, page by page. He'd said yes to this because of something unfinished that had followed him for 30 years, and now he was finishing it the only way available to him, by doing the work so precisely that there would be no question, no room for doubt. No version of events in which he'd cut a corner or accepted something almost right. Cassie understood this. She'd understood it from the first day he showed up and asked his 4 precise questions. She didn't say so, but she built her own pace around his, and between them they found a rhythm that covered ground faster than the timeline Gus had estimated. Danny was learning things that weren't on any curriculum. He'd started by sweeping, then handing tools, then being shown, then being asked to do the simpler tasks himself, bolt torque checks, harness routing inspections, the kind of work that required attention and care, but not yet the depth of judgment that came from years of making mistakes and learning from them. Then Gus, one Tuesday morning without preamble or ceremony, handed him a set of calibration specifications for the tail rotor control input and said, "Check these against what we've installed. Show me your work." Danny looked at the specs. Looked at the helicopter, looked back at Gus. All of them, Gus said. He poured coffee from his thermos and sat down. It took Danny 4 hours. He made one error, caught it himself, corrected it, and documented the correction without being asked to. Gus looked over the work for about 7 minutes and then set it down. "Good," he said. Danny understood that from Gus, good was not a small word. Cassie watched all of this from the corner of her eye while she worked. There was something happening with Danny that she hadn't fully anticipated. When he'd shown up 6 weeks ago with his second-hand welding helmet, she'd seen a kid who wanted to learn, which was fine, which was good even. She'd needed the help and she'd needed the company, and she'd needed, on certain long cold evenings, someone to hand her a wrench without her having to ask. But now she was watching something else. She was watching a person find the thing they were for. The specific kind of absorption that happened when a person encountered work that matched the shape of their mind. Danny moved through the barn differently than he had in October. Less tentative, more purposeful. Not because anyone had given him permission, because he'd stopped waiting for it. She thought about that sometimes, in the small hours when she was alone and the radio was on, and Iron Moth was quiet in the lamplight. She thought about what it was worth, one person finding the thing they were for, whether that was its own justification for everything else. Then she picked up her tools and got back to it. The town council meeting was on a Wednesday in the first week of November, 3 weeks after the letter. The council chamber was on the second floor of the municipal building, a room that smelled like old carpet and heating duct, and the particular institutional neutrality of rooms designed not to suggest anything in particular. Cassie arrived 5 minutes early. Walt was with her, 4 days out of the hospital, walking carefully but present, which was the only thing that mattered. Helen Voss was already seated near the back. Danny sat next to Cassie, wearing the cleanest flannel shirt she'd seen him in. Ray Stoll sat on the other side of the room with a man Cassie didn't recognize, who had the look of someone Ray had brought along to create the impression of numbers. The council was 5 people, 3 women, 2 men. The chair was a retired school teacher named Dorothy Albright, who had been running the council for 9 years with the particular firm patience of someone who had once managed 32 8th graders at once and found nothing subsequent particularly difficult. Ray Stoll presented first. He had printed materials. He spoke for 12 minutes about Section 14.3 and fire risk and proximity to residential structures, and the term experimental aircraft. He said experimental aircraft 4 times. He said community safety 7 times. He said it with the practiced sincerity of a man who had rehearsed which emotions to deploy. Dorothy Albright listened with her hands folded on the table. When Ray finished, she looked at Cassie. Cassie stood up. She didn't have printed materials. She had Gus Aldridge, who was sitting against the far wall and stood when she looked at him. 71 years old, 30 years of FAA credentials, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. She said his name and his background and let that sit for a moment. She had Walt Deacon, who she didn't introduce, because everyone in Gravel Creek knew Walt and knew what he'd lost, and nobody needed it explained. And she had Helen Voss. She hadn't planned on Helen speaking. Helen hadn't told her she was going to. But Helen stood up from the back of the room without being invited to, and the room looked at her, and she said, "I live on the Vaugh property, 12 miles east. I have lived there my entire life. I am the nearest private landowner in the direction that aircraft would fly when and if it leaves that barn." She paused. "If I am not concerned about my safety, I would like to understand whose safety is being protected." Ray Stoll started to say something. Dorothy Albright raised one hand very slightly, and he stopped. The vote was 4-1. Cassie was free to continue. She drove home, went into the barn, stood in front of Iron Moth. She had not told the council everything. She had not told them about the 8-month clock, about the envelope in her jacket pocket that she still hadn't opened, about Roy's letter and the coordinates and the word in her notebook. Some things didn't belong in a council chamber. Some things belonged only in a barn, in the lamplight, between a woman and a helicopter, and the ghost of the man who'd built it. She went back to work. The discovery happened on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, which was the kind of morning that started quietly and then wasn't. Gus had been working through the tail rotor control assembly with the methodical focus he brought to everything. Cassie was on the other side of the aircraft dealing with the main rotor hub. Danny was running torque verification checks on the recently fabricated linkage components Pete Harmon had delivered the week before. The new components built to Roy's corrected specifications, because they'd gone back to Pete after Gus's first assessment and asked for remakes with the adjusted geometry. So they were all working, all focused. And then Gus said very quietly, "Cassie." Not urgently. He almost never said anything urgently. But there was something in it. She came around to his side. He was crouching near the lower attachment point of the tail rotor control linkage, one of the new components, and he had his flashlight angled into a space that was difficult to see any other way. He didn't say anything. He just moved the flashlight so she could look. She looked, and she saw it. A dimensional error in the fabricated component. Small. The kind of thing that required a micrometer to catch and Gus's specific expertise to understand the implications of. The component was not wrong enough to be obvious. It was wrong in the way that mattered most, the quiet way. The way that would sit there invisible and silent and fine through every ground test, through the first hover, through the first circuit, and then at some point, at some altitude under some crosswind load, begin to resonate. Gus had caught it before it mattered. That was the point. That was why the 400 hours existed. That was why Gus Aldridge's career had been built on the premise that catching something before it mattered was the entire job. But catching it still meant fixing it. And fixing it meant 6 more weeks. Maybe 7. At a minimum. Because the component would have to go back to Pete. Pete would have to remake it to the corrected specification, which he could do, which he would do. But Pete Harmon did not rush, and she would not ask him to, because the last thing she needed was a rushed replacement of the component they'd just discovered was critically wrong. 6 weeks. She did the math in her head. Standing there in the barn in the cold morning light with Gus's flashlight illuminating the gap between what should have been and what was. The barn lease expired in the last week of March. The current timeline, before this, had them completing the 400 hours by mid-February. That gave her 6 weeks to get the certification paperwork processed and a flight test scheduled before the March deadline. Now the mid-February completion date was gone. Now it was end of February at the earliest. Maybe first week of March. That was not 6 weeks. That was 3. 3 weeks between completing the process and having nowhere legal to be. She stood there. Gus watched her doing the calculation. He'd done it himself, she could tell. He'd done it before he called her name. "We keep going," she said. "Yes," he said. Not as a question. As confirmation. "I'll call Pete today. I'll call Pete. I need to explain the specification change." She looked at him. "Thank you." He looked back at her steadily. "Don't thank me yet." Danny had been watching from across the barn. He'd caught enough of the exchange to understand the shape of it without knowing all the details. He came over when Gus moved away to make his call. "Bad," he said. "Manageable," Cassie said. He thought about this. "Is that the same as bad, but you're not going to say so?" She looked at him. "Get back to your talk checks." He went back to his talk checks. But she caught him looking at her twice in the next hour. The way a person checks on someone they're worried about without wanting to make a thing of it. She didn't say anything. She found it quietly steadying, which surprised her. Dale Hurst came back in late November. It was a Thursday. Cassie was alone in the barn. Gus was in Wyoming for the week. Danny was in school. The barn was cold and quiet, and she was running vibration damping calculations, which required concentration and silence and a willingness to stare at numbers for extended periods without result, which she was managing. She heard a truck, not the government SUV, a regular truck. She heard the door and then footsteps on the gravel, and then the barn door opened. She looked up. Dale Hurst. But wrong. No clipboard, no gray suit, jeans, a heavy canvas work jacket. He'd come from somewhere or was going somewhere that wasn't an official visit. And he'd stopped here in between. He looked different without the suit, or rather, he looked more like a person, which was, she supposed, the suit's function. She put down her pencil and waited. He walked toward Iron Moth slowly. He looked at the helicopter the way she'd seen Walt look at it, and the way Helen had looked at it, and the way Gus looked at it in his first 20 minutes. The way people looked at things that meant more to them than they'd anticipated. "I read Roy Deacon's original proposal," he said. "The 1990 submission. I requested the file from the archive when I got back from my first visit here." She said nothing. The rejection assessment at the time cited insufficient experimental testing protocols for non-standard rotorcraft configurations. He looked at the tail section of Iron Moth. That was accurate in 1990. FAA Order 8130.2 didn't have adequate rotorcraft provisions until the 2006 revision. He paused. If he'd submitted in 2007, it would have gone differently. He didn't know that. No. Hurst was quiet for a moment. He couldn't have known it. The revision was 17 years away. He looked at her. His design was right. "I want you to know I looked at it, as carefully as I could, and it was right." Cassie was very still. "I'm not here officially," Hurst said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here as a representative of the district office." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folder. Set it on the workbench beside her. "That's a copy of the experimental rotorcraft testing criteria from the 2022 revision of 8130.2. Updated certification benchmarks. If Aldridge is doing your DRR review, he already has access to these. But the 2022 version has some provisions that can be applied to legacy designs in ways that the 2019 version didn't allow, which might affect how your testing documentation is structured. She looked at the folder, then at him. Why, she said. He thought about the question for a moment, like it deserved a genuine answer. Because I've been doing this job for 26 years, he said. And most of what I do is apply rules correctly. That's what the job is. Don't deviate. The rules exist for reasons, and the reasons matter. He looked at Iron Moth. But sometimes you look at a file, and you see that the rules were applied correctly, and the outcome was still wrong, and you have to figure out what you're going to do with that. She waited. I'm not going to do anything that compromises the process, he said. The certification has to be clean. Everything Aldridge signs off on has to hold up to review. I can't touch that. He nodded at the folder. But that's public information. It's in the archive. Anyone can access it. She picked up the folder. Thank you. He shook his head slightly, like she'd missed the point, or like the point wasn't the kind of thing you thanked someone for. He left without saying anything else. She called Gus that evening, told him about the 2022 revision provisions. Gus was quiet on the phone for longer than usual, which meant he was reading something. Then this changes the framing on 4 sections of our testing documentation. It doesn't reduce what we need to do, but it reduces the review turnaround time at the district office. Another pause, 2 weeks, maybe 3. That was the margin they needed. That was all they needed. Pete came through. He always came through. The replacement component arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of December, wrapped in shop cloth the way Pete wrapped everything. Gus inspected it for 45 minutes with measuring instruments that had their own case and their own ritual of deployment. Then he set down the last instrument and looked at Cassie. This one's right, he said. They put it in. December was the long middle, the part of any hard thing that didn't have the energy of the beginning or the clarity of the end. Just the work. Day after day. Checklist item after checklist item. Cassie's hands knew the aircraft the way hands only know something after months of daily contact. By touch in the dark, by sound, by the particular resistance of each fastener and the specific quality of each system's response. Danny was running full inspections now, not supervised. Or rather, supervised only in the way that Gus sat somewhere in the barn and was available if needed, which was the right kind of supervision for someone who had passed the point of needing someone next to them and needed instead the experience of trusting their own judgment in real time. He made 2 minor errors in December, caught both himself, corrected both, documented both, didn't mention either to Cassie until she specifically asked him to walk her through his December logs. She looked at the logs. The 2 corrections noted clearly explained accurately. Good, she said. He understood what good meant now. Walt came back to the barn in the 2nd week of December. Not 4 days after the hospital like he'd wanted. Not 2 weeks like they'd negotiated. Exactly 11 days, which was the compromise neither of them had said out loud. He came back with his coffee and his folding chair and a new story about Roy. This one about the time Roy had stayed up for 36 hours to finish a set of calculations, and then discovered that the pad of paper he'd been writing on had a carbon copy sheet underneath, and he'd made a perfect copy of everything he'd calculated, which was both useful and completely accidental, and delighted Roy to a degree that Walt said was, in retrospect, a window into the particular way Roy's mind worked. Cassie listened while she worked. Danny listened while he ran checks. The barn was cold. The radio was on. Things were almost as they'd been before the hospital visit. Almost. Not quite. Walt moved more carefully. He got up from the folding chair more slowly. He checked his phone occasionally in a way he hadn't before. Small things. But Cassie noticed them. He was paying attention to his own fragility in a way he hadn't needed to before. Or hadn't let himself. She thought about the envelope in her jacket pocket. The one he'd given her in the hospital. The one she still hadn't opened. She thought about Roy Deacon, not opening things, not finishing things. The gap between intent and completion. She was not going to leave that envelope unopened indefinitely. She was just waiting for the right moment. The moment when she'd know whether she needed what was in it or whether she didn't. She didn't know yet. The 400th hour of documented ground testing was logged at 3:40 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of February. Gus signed the final page of the testing documentation. He signed it with the specific deliberateness of a person who understood that what they were signing was not just a form. He closed the folder, set it on the workbench, looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Iron Moth. "She's ready," he said. Those 2 words. In that specific voice. From that specific man who had spent 30 years knowing the difference between ready and nearly ready. Cassie stood there and felt something she'd been holding for months begin to loosen. Not gone. Not released. Just looser. Like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long that you'd forgotten what loose felt like, and then suddenly loose existed again. Gus submitted the completed documentation to the FAA Flight Standards District Office in Helena. He called the district office personally, which he almost never did, and spoke to someone he'd worked with for 15 years, and said the things that needed to be said about turnaround time, without requesting expedited processing, without applying any pressure. Just a conversation between 2 people who knew each other and knew what the work entailed. The response came in 18 days, which was, as Gus said when he called to tell her, fast. Not unprecedented, but fast. Experimental aircraft certification. N7841 Romeo. Iron Moth approved. The flight test was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the first week of March. The grass field on the eastern edge of the Merritt property, the flat half-acre behind the barn that her father had kept cleared because he liked to be able to see the full sky from that direction. Gus would be present as Dr. Dale Hurst had arranged to be present as the district office representative, which was technically optional and not technically a conflict but was also not an accident. Walt knew. Helen had been told. Danny had known for a week and had the specific, barely contained quality of a person sitting on information they very much want to talk about and have agreed not to. The morning of the test, Cassie woke up at 4. She lay in the dark for a while, thinking about Roy Deacon staying up for 36 hours doing calculations on a carbon copy pad, thinking about a brass compass with initials on the back, thinking about coordinates and the word someday, and the envelope in her jacket pocket hanging on the hook by the door. She got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the dark, picked up the jacket, took out the envelope. She'd been telling herself she was waiting for the right moment, but she understood now, sitting in the dark kitchen at 4 in the morning, that the right moment wasn't when she needed it. The right moment was when she could read it without needing it, when she was steady enough to take whatever was in it on its own terms. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The writing was Walt's. Small and careful, Cassie. If you're reading this, you're thinking about stopping. Don't. I'm going to tell you something I didn't tell Roy when I should have. I don't know if telling him would have changed anything, but I know I'll spend the rest of my life wondering. He was right about everything. The design, the aircraft, the geometry, all of it. He was right. He stopped not because he was wrong, but because he couldn't find anyone who would tell him he was right when it mattered. I was standing next to him the whole time, and I didn't say it enough. I said it sometimes, but not enough. You're right. Whatever doubt you're having right now, you're right. The aircraft is sound. The work is good. You are not your father's bad luck or your bad timing or the $4,000 you spent on something nobody else wanted. You are the person who bought the thing nobody else wanted and spent 8 months making it what it was always supposed to be. Finish it. Love, Walt. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her shirt pocket. She finished her coffee, got dressed, went to the barn. Iron Moth stood in the lamplight, the same way she'd been standing since October. Patient. Ready. Painted now, the new coat Cassie and Danny had applied in January, deep matte navy with a single silver stripe running the length of the tail boom. Beneath the registration number on the tail, in Cassie's own handwriting, transferred carefully to stencil and then to paint. Direction isn't always forward. She'd added that in January. One morning before anyone else arrived. She hadn't announced it. Danny had noticed it 2 days later and asked what it meant. She'd said, "It means sometimes you go back to something before you can go forward at all." He'd thought about that, nodded, gone back to work. She walked around Iron Moth one full time, touching nothing, just looking, taking inventory of the months of work with her eyes. Every fastener she knew, every system, every calculation that had been wrong and made right, every hour of Gus's careful documentation, every component Pete had fabricated in that workshop 2 hours south and delivered wrapped in shop cloth. She stopped at the cockpit door, opened it, climbed in, sat in the pilot's seat for the first time without a reason other than to be there. The controls were familiar under her hands. She'd adjusted them, calibrated them, verified them against specifications so many times that her hands knew the weight of them. She sat with her hands resting on the collective and the cyclic, and looked at the instrument panel and the view through the windscreen, which was the inside of the barn, the lamp, the far wall with Roy's letter, and the photograph of Roy pinned side by side. She sat there for a while. The people arrived at 7:30. Walt first. Then Helen, who didn't say anything, just stood by the barn door with her hands in her pockets. Then Danny, who was wearing the cleanest jacket she'd seen him own. Gus had arrived at 7 and was running his own final checklist with his measuring instruments, because that was Gus, and the day of the flight test was not the day to stop being Gus. Dale Hurst arrived at 7:55 in a gray vehicle that was not the government SUV. He brought a clipboard because some things persisted. He also brought, which Cassie noticed and said nothing about, a thermos that suggested he was planning to be here for the duration. She ran the pre-flight, every item, every check, the way Gus had taught her to run it, which was the way the documentation required it, which was the way Roy had designed the aircraft to be run if it was run properly. Gus signed off the checklist. Dale Hurst looked at the signed checklist, looked at Gus. Gus looked back. Something passed between them that was 30 years of shared professional history, and a certain amount of mutual respect and an acknowledgement that what was about to happen was correct. Hurst nodded. Cassie climbed into the cockpit. She put on the headset, ran through the startup sequence. The engine turned over, coughed once, the way it always coughed once, the way she'd come to think of as iron moth clearing her throat. Then caught, then ran. The rotors began to move, slowly at first. That was always the moment. The moment when the rotors moved from still to moving, when the aircraft went from a thing on the ground to a thing that remembered what it had been built to do. They picked up speed, the familiar sound building, the low percussive rhythm of the blades cycling. She felt the airframe come alive under her in the way that only happened when everything was working together, when the tolerances were right and the systems were speaking to each other correctly. She looked at the instrument panel, oil pressure, rotor RPM, everything in range, everything where it was supposed to be. She took a breath. She pulled the collective, gently, the way you'd pick up something you'd been waiting to hold for a very long time. Iron Moth rose 6 feet, then 10, then 15. She held it there, hovering, the grass below her bending in the rotor wash. The field stretched out in the early March light, still brown from winter, and beyond it the eastern sky going pale gold at the horizon. 90 seconds. She held the hover for 90 seconds and ran every sensation through her assessment as she'd been trained to: rotor feel, tail response, collective authority, pedal authority, and everything came back right. Not almost right. Right. She moved forward, just slightly. A gentle push on the cyclic, a small correction, and Iron Moth responded the way Roy Deacon's drawings said she should respond. Smooth and immediate and completely without the lag that standard linkage geometry would have introduced. The tail rotor linkage worked. 32 years after Roy Deacon designed it. 5 months after Cassie Merritt decided to build it. It worked exactly the way he said it would. She completed one small circuit of the field, low and slow, and then brought Iron Moth back to the hover and settled her down until the skids touched the grass. She sat in the cockpit for a moment after the engine went off. Just sat. Then she climbed out. Gus was making notes on his clipboard. He finished his notes. He looked up at her. "Pass," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. And in his face, she saw the thing she'd been looking for without knowing it. Not pride, exactly. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. Something that looked like what it felt like to set down something you'd been carrying for 30 years and find out it had been worth carrying. She walked to the workbench in the barn, opened her notebook to the page with the coordinates, looked at the words she'd written under them in October. Someday. She found her pencil, crossed out someday, wrote tomorrow. Then she went back outside to where the people were waiting, in the March light, in the field where Iron Moth was resting on the grass, and she didn't say anything. And that was right, because some moments weren't for saying things. Some moments were just for standing in, and knowing what you'd done, and letting it be real. The article was 4 paragraphs long. A local paper. The kind that's still printed on actual paper, that you could find in a stack by the door at the diner and the hardware store and the county agricultural office. A reporter, someone Cassie had gone to high school with, or whose sister she'd gone to high school with, she couldn't quite remember, had driven out to the Merritt barn 2 days after the flight test and asked if he could ask some questions. She said yes because saying no felt ungrateful for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. 4 paragraphs. A photograph of Iron Moth on the grass field in the early March light, Cassie standing beside her in her work jacket with her arms at her sides, squinting slightly into the sun. The headline said something about a local mechanic and an experimental aircraft, and the word restored. She read it once, thought fine, went back to work. Except the paper got picked up by a regional outlet, which got picked up by a wire service. Which meant that 8 days after a 4-paragraph article in a county paper, Cassie's phone was making sounds she wasn't accustomed to, and her email contained messages from people she had never heard of, and someone from a morning television program in Billings wanted to schedule a call. She declined the morning television program. She declined 2 magazine inquiries. She declined a podcast, which felt almost easy by comparison. She did not decline the University of Montana, but only because Danny wouldn't let her. The letter from the university arrived on a Tuesday. School of Engineering. An invitation to speak at a spring symposium. Women in Aviation and Mechanical Engineering. 200 attendees. Faculty, students, industry professionals. 12 weeks out. She put the letter on the workbench. Left it there for 4 days without opening it a second time. Danny found it on day 5, because Danny had developed an instinct for locating things Cassie was avoiding. He read it, set it down, looked at her. "You have to go," he said. "I'm not a speaker, you just flew a helicopter you rebuilt from a 30-year-old wreck. That's not the same thing, it's better than being a speaker." She looked at him. He looked back, with the stubbornness of a teenager who had learned exactly which battles were worth choosing and had chosen this one. "What would I even say?" she said. "The truth. That's not enough for 200 people. It was enough for me," he said. And then he picked up his wrench and went back to work, which was, she recognized, a perfectly timed exit. He'd learned that from watching her, which meant she had no one to blame. She went inside that night and sat at the kitchen table and thought about it for a long time. Thought about Roy Deacon's letter. The part that said, "If you found this, then you know what you're doing." Thought about what it meant to be found worthy of something by a person who would never know you. Thought about Walt's letter. "You are not your father's bad luck." She called the university in the morning and said yes. For the next 3 weeks she went back and forth on it approximately 900 times. She told Gus she was dreading it. Gus said, "You rebuilt a helicopter no one else wanted to touch. Talking is easier than that." She told Walt she didn't know what she was doing. Walt said, Roy didn't know what he was doing when he started building Iron Moth. He just knew why. She told Danny she was probably going to embarrass herself. Danny said, "Good. Embarrassment means you tried." None of this helped as much as it should have, but she appreciated the consistency. She did not bring a presentation. She did not bring notes. She brought Roy Deacon's flight log because it was the only honest thing she owned that belonged to this story, and she needed something in her hands that she trusted completely. The auditorium held the 200 people the letter had mentioned, and also, it turned out, about 40 more who'd heard and come anyway. She stood in the back hallway before it started and had approximately 30 seconds of pure animal panic. The kind where your body has opinions that are completely incompatible with the situation you've put it in. She thought, Roy Deacon stayed up for 6 months testing a linkage system that everyone said wouldn't work. He submitted it to people who told him no. He kept going, until he didn't. And then he left a letter in a box inside a helicopter for someone he'd never meet, because he hadn't completely stopped hoping. She walked through the door. She stood at the podium in her work boots and her good jeans and the flannel shirt she'd ironed that morning, which had used up more nervous energy than she'd expected. She looked at 240 faces, faculty in the front rows, students behind them, some of them with the confidence of people who had credentials and knew it, some with the look she recognized from Danny's first weeks in the barn. The look of someone who wasn't sure yet whether they were allowed to be there. She opened the flight log to a page she'd marked with a piece of wire. "This was written by a man named Roy Deacon," she said. "He built a helicopter in a rented shop in Billings between 1988 and 1991. He designed his own tail rotor control system. He submitted it to the FAA. They told him no." She paused. He wrote this the night before they gave him their final answer. She read it. The entry was short. Roy's small handwriting, slightly uneven from the late hour or the tension or both. She read it the way you read something that cost the person who wrote it something real. I don't know whether I'm more afraid of failing or of succeeding. Both require things of me I'm not certain I have. I've been building this aircraft for 3 years and I still don't know if I'm the kind of person who finishes things. She closed the flight log. He didn't finish it, she said. I did. 5 months ago. In my father's barn in Gravel Creek with a retired FAA inspector from Wyoming and a 17-year-old kid who showed up one morning with a second-hand welding helmet and asked if he could help. She looked at the room. I'm not telling you this because it's an inspiring story. I'm telling you this because Roy Deacon was right about his design and wrong about himself. And those two things were allowed to be true at the same time. And nobody ever told him that clearly enough. She stopped. The room was quiet in the way that meant something. I failed my first welding certification, she said. I got told twice by people I respected that I wasn't detail-oriented enough for precision mechanical work. I spent 3 years taking jobs nobody else wanted after my father's garage went under. And then I spent $4,000 on a helicopter that hadn't flown in 32 years. She looked at the flight log in her hands. I didn't do any of that because I knew it would work. I did it because I couldn't figure out how to stop. Somebody in the front row started clapping. Then the row behind them. Then it moved back through the room, and Cassie stood at the podium and didn't quite know where to look. So she looked at the flight log, which was familiar and didn't require anything from her. She walked off stage afterward and went directly to the hallway and stood there for a minute just breathing. A young woman found her there, maybe 20 years old, first or second year, from the look of her lanyard. She had a backpack and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not quite managing it. I was going to drop my program, she said. Aerospace engineering. I was going to send the email last Tuesday. Cassie looked at her. I haven't sent it, the young woman said. Good, Cassie said. I just want to say that. Okay. The young woman nodded, pulled her backpack strap up, walked away. Cassie stood in the hallway a moment longer. Then she drove 3 hours back to Gravel Creek. The whole drive she thought about Roy Deacon's flight log entry. I still don't know if I'm the kind of person who finishes things. She thought about how he'd never found out while he was alive to know it. And then she thought about the tin box in the cockpit wall, and the letter, and the compass, and a man who drove a stake into a field on his worst day just to prove to himself that he'd been there. She got home at 9 in the evening, went to the barn, ran her hand along the tail boom of Iron Moth the way she did every night. Not checking anything, just touching. Then she went inside and slept for 9 hours straight, which was the longest she'd slept since October. 2 things happened the following week that she hadn't anticipated. The first was the barn lease. The landlord, a farmer named Doug Kettrick who owned the surrounding property and had rented the barn to her father for 20 years before renting it to her, called on a Wednesday morning. She'd been dreading this call. The lease had run through March. They were now in April. She'd been operating on a handshake extension and the goodwill of a man who had liked her father and seemed to tolerate her. But Doug didn't call about the overdue renewal. He called to tell her he'd decided to sell the barn outright and that he wanted to give her first right of refusal before he listed it. The price he named was fair. Not cheap, but fair. She said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 4 hours. Then she called him back and said yes. She didn't have the full amount in her account. She had about 60% of it, saved over years of careful living and no unnecessary expenses, plus the 3 months of income from the jobs she'd taken since the flight test. She arranged the rest through the County Agricultural Bank, a 30-year loan at a rate that made her wince slightly but not enough to stop her. She owned the Merritt barn. She owned the land under it. She stood in the middle of the floor after she hung up the phone and looked at Iron Moth and said, out loud, to no one, we're staying. The second thing that happened was Ray Stull. Not dramatically. Not in a way that required anything from her. He came in one afternoon while she was running a routine maintenance check on Iron Moth, alone, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and he looked like a man who had rehearsed something and was now questioning whether he'd rehearsed it correctly. She waited. I heard about the flight test, he said. Heard about the certification. She kept her hands on the work. Word travels. It does. He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to say. He started again. The call I made to the Fa, I told myself it was about safety. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. I think I knew at the time that wasn't the whole truth. She didn't say anything. She looked at him and waited. Anyway, he said. That's all. He left. She stood there for a moment after his truck pulled out. Then she put down her tools, walked to the barn door, looked at the empty lot. She thought about what it cost a man like Ray Stull to walk through a door and say that. Thought about what it cost most people to say they'd been wrong. Thought about Roy Deacon, who'd stopped building rather than admit to himself that he'd made an assumption that wasn't true. She picked her tools back up, got back to work. Ray Stull's name came up occasionally after that in the way names came up in small towns. Nothing significant. No more council motions. No more calls to government offices. He ran his garage. She ran hers. Gravel Creek was big enough for that. Just barely. And they both seemed to understand it. The Merritt Barn Saturdays started the weekend after she got back from the university. Not because she'd planned it formally. Because Danny had mentioned to someone that she'd done a presentation at the university, and that someone had mentioned it to someone else. And by Friday afternoon, she had 6 phone calls from parents asking if their daughters could come Saturday to learn something about mechanical work. She said yes. 11 people showed up, ages ranging from 13 to 17. They arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm and varying degrees of appropriate footwear, and one of them arrived with a notebook already open, which Cassie took as a good sign. She didn't have a curriculum. She had a barn and a helicopter and tools and 20 years of doing the work, so that was what she gave them. She showed them how to read a torque specification, how to tell the difference between a stripped fastener and one that had been correctly torqued, how to use a wire brush without damaging the surface it was cleaning, which sounded obvious and was not. How to look at a wiring harness and understand what it was telling you about the system it served. Danny taught the welding segment. He'd been doing it since the 3rd Saturday, and he was, it turned out, a natural teacher, in the way of people who remembered clearly what it had felt like not to know something. He used that memory to stay patient. He didn't condescend. He explained things the way Cassie had explained things to him, by showing and then stepping back. She watched him one afternoon from across the barn, coaching a 14-year-old through her second attempt at a bead weld, and she thought, there it is. There's the thing she'd seen starting to take shape in October, in the kid who showed up with a second-hand welding helmet and asked if he could help. It had become something real, something he could give to other people. Gus came to the 3rd Saturday. He sat in the folding chair Walt usually occupied, because Walt was coming less frequently now, more carefully, and Gus seemed to understand this without being told. He watched the session for an hour and a half. At the end he pulled Cassie aside. You have one in the welding group, he said. The tall one with the brown braid. Ruthie, Cassie said. She's recalibrating the torch angle before every pass without being told. Self-correcting in real time. He looked at Cassie steadily. She has it. Cassie looked over at Ruthie, who was running a bead on a scrap piece of sheet metal with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had forgotten other people were in the room. Yeah, Cassie said. I know. Gus nodded, picked up his thermos. Good program, he said. From Gus, that was a speech. Walt came on the 4th Saturday, late, which was unlike him. He settled into his chair with the care of a man who was negotiating terms with his own body, but he had his coffee and he had a story. This one was about the time Roy had calculated the wrong unit conversion and spent 2 weeks building a component to the wrong dimensions before catching it, which was the story of a competent person doing a foolish thing and refusing to let the foolishness define the competence. The girls listened. Some laughed at the right parts. One of them, a quiet 13-year-old named Carla, who had said almost nothing in 3 previous Saturdays, asked Walt, "Did he give up after that?" Walt looked at her for a moment, like he was deciding how to answer. Then he rebuilt it from scratch, and the second version was better than the first would have been. Carla wrote something in her notebook. Cassie didn't read it, but she saw her write it, and she thought about Roy's flight log and about all the notebooks that had absorbed things over the years that ended up meaning more than the person writing them knew at the time. Helen Voss came to the 5th Saturday. She didn't announce she was coming. She just arrived quietly, the way she'd arrived at the barn that first time in October. She sat near the door and watched. At the end, when the girls were packing up, one of them 16, interested in aviation maintenance, asked Helen, "Do you fly?" Helen looked at her. "No," she said. "But I know someone who did. And I know someone who does now." She nodded toward Cassie, which turns out to be almost the same thing. The girl thought about this. How is it almost the same? Helen's expression was quiet but not closed. "Because the story gets to continue," she said. April moved into May. Montana made its slow, convincing argument for warmth, and the barn doors stayed open in the afternoons for the first time since October. The folding chairs migrated outside on clear Saturdays. The grass in the field behind the barn went green. The same field where Iron Moth had hovered for 90 seconds in the early March light, while Gus's clipboard said pass and Dale Hurst nodded once. Cassie flew Iron Moth twice a week when the weather allowed. Short flights, local, within the parameters of the experimental certification. She was building hours and building familiarity, and building the kind of trust between a pilot and an aircraft that only came from time in the air together. Each flight was logged. Each flight was documented. Because that was how you did it correctly, and because doing it correctly was the only way she knew how to do anything. She filed the flight plan for the coordinates on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April. Early, before the barn opened, before anyone arrived. She hadn't told Danny until the night before. She told Walt that same night by phone, and he was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment and then said, "Good, it's time." She told Helen in person. She drove to the Voss property, knocked on the door. Helen answered with the calm of someone who had lived alone on land for 30 years and was not startled by unexpected knocks. "I'm going to the coordinates tomorrow morning," Cassie said. "I thought you should know." Helen looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise. More like the recognition of something she'd been waiting for without quite letting herself name it. "What time?" she said. "Sunrise, maybe just before." Helen nodded. Once. Slowly. "I'll be there." Cassie was up at 4. Not because of the alarm. Because of the quality of the dark before something is about to happen, which has its own texture if you've learned to recognize it. She made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking at nothing in particular, thinking about Roy Deacon in a rented shop in 1988, starting on something he didn't know yet whether he could finish. Thinking about the first time she'd touched Iron Moth's fuselage in Gord Feeney's equipment shed, outside Dillon, and the feeling she'd had that she still couldn't exactly name. Not hope. Something more provisional than hope. A willingness to find out. She put on her jacket, checked the pockets by habit. Walt's letter, folded, worn at the creases now from months of being carried. The brass compass with RD on the back. The metal tag with the coordinates clipped to her notebook. She went to the barn. Pre-flight was methodical and complete, her hands moving through the sequence without needing to think about it. The way they moved through any sequence she'd done enough times that it had become part of her. Everything checked. Everything correct. Iron Moth's engine caught on the first try. She always caught on the first try now. As if she'd remembered, over months of use, what she was built for. The sky was just beginning to separate from the land as Cassie lifted off. That pre-dawn moment where the horizon exists as a line between two kinds of dark rather than between dark and light. She climbed to 800 feet, leveled out, turned east, 12 miles. At the airspeed she was running, 4 minutes, she used them to look at the land below her. Still brown in places, the way April in Montana was brown before things committed to green. The river running through the eastern quarter of the county, catching the first gray light. Straight lines of county roads. Irregular shapes of farmland, dark clusters of ranch buildings with their early lights beginning to show. She thought about Roy up here, in 9987 in a crop duster, looking down at a woman in a south field who looked up at him. The distance between two people and everything that fit inside it. She saw the Voss property from a distance, recognized it from the satellite image she'd looked at so many times it had become as familiar as her own land. The house set back from the road. The barn, the grain storage structures, and then beyond them the open fields running east to the tree line. Oak trees at the far edge, old ones, the kind that had been there long enough to make everything near them feel small. She circled once, low 300 feet. She could see the field clearly, and she could see Helen Voss, a small figure standing at the edge of the tree line, her hands in her coat pockets, her face tipped up toward the sound. Cassie brought Iron Moth down. The grass bent flat in the rotor wash as she descended. She touched down with the slight give of April soft earth under the skids. She ran through the shutdown sequence. The rotors slowed. The engine quieted. And then there was the silence that followed. The silence of something that had been running going still, which always felt like holding a breath. She climbed out. Helen was walking toward her across the field, not hurrying. The walk of a person covering ground they knew with intention. They met somewhere in the middle, near the eastern end of the field where the grass gave way to shorter vegetation, and the first oak stood at the edge of the tree line. And Cassie saw it. She almost missed it. It was not designed to be seen from any distance. It was not designed to be seen at all. Not really. A metal stake driven into the ground at the base of the first oak. Small, the kind of survey stake you'd use to mark a precise location. The paint was long gone, stripped by years of Montana freeze and thaw. The metal had gone the brownish red of old rust. Attached to the stake was a small metal tag, the same kind as the one that had been in the tin box in the cockpit. On the tag, in stamped letters that the rust had not quite managed to erase, Art 14.03.1991. March 14th, 1991. The day the FAA gave Roy Deacon their final answer. The day Walt had given Cassie the document that told her Roy had signed Iron Moth over in his will to whoever would be willing to finish it. He had come here on that day, to this exact place. He had driven the stake himself, which meant he had brought it, which meant he had planned it, which meant this was not an impulse. He had come to this field on the worst day of his professional life, the day everything institutional had told him no for the last time, and he had driven a metal stake into the earth that said, "I was here. I came as far as I could. I tried." Not a marker of failure, a marker of effort. A record for a witness who would never come, in a field he believed was empty of the person he'd built everything to reach. Cassie stood looking at the stake. Helen came up beside her. They stood together looking at it for a while before either of them spoke. Helen's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "That day I stayed inside," she said. "All day. I didn't go out to the south fields." She crouched down slowly and looked at the date on the tag. "If I had been out here, if I'd seen him standing in this field." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "He thought you were gone," Cassie said. Not to soften anything, just as the plain fact it was. "I know," Helen said. "Walt told me." She touched the metal tag with 2 fingers. Carefully, the way you touched something that might not be solid. "All these years. I walked past this tree 100 times. I never knew." She stood back up, slowly, and she looked at the stake with an expression that was not grief exactly, though there was grief in it. It was the look of a person absorbing a fact that changed the shape of something they'd been carrying for a long time. Not making it lighter, just different, clearer. Cassie reached into her jacket pocket, took out the brass compass with RD on the back. She held it for a moment. Then she set it in the grass beside the stake, in the notch where the root of the oak met the earth. She took Roy's letter from the envelope in her other pocket, the one from the tin box in the cockpit wall, the one she'd read and reread and hung on the barn wall and carried with her for months. She folded it once more and tucked it under the base of the stake where the grass had grown over the rusted metal. She stood up. Helen reached into her own coat pocket and took out a folded piece of paper, older than anything Cassie was carrying, the fold lines soft with age. She held it out. "He sent this in August of 1991, Helen said. 5 months after that." She nodded at the stake. "It was the last to have it, to put with the flight log. So the record is complete." Cassie took it. She didn't open it there. She held it. "Thank you," she said. Helen looked at Iron Moth across the field. In the early morning light, the deep matte navy had a quality that shifted with the angle of the sun. Something the daylight hours changed. The silver stripe on the tail boom caught the gold of early morning and held it. "She's beautiful," Helen said. "She is," Cassie said. They stood there without speaking for a while, just stood. In the April field with the oaks at their backs, an Iron Moth resting on the soft ground and the sky going from gray to gold at the horizon. Then Cassie walked back across the field. Pre-flight checks again, because that was the rule, and the rule didn't take days off. She climbed in, started the engine. She looked out through the windscreen at Helen, who was standing at the field's edge watching. Helen raised one hand. Not a wave. Something more deliberate. An acknowledgement of something that didn't have a simpler gesture. Cassie lifted off. She climbed slowly, turning west, and she looked down as long as she could at the field and the tree line and the oak and the small rust-colored stake at its base, and the woman standing in the April light watching Iron Moth rise. Then she pointed the nose west and flew home. Spring came the way Montana spring came, gradually and then suddenly. The grass went green. The barn doors stayed open in the afternoons. The folding chairs got moved outside on Saturdays when the weather was right. The Saturdays grew. 14 regulars by May. 17 by June. Danny had taken over the full welding curriculum and was developing his own style of teaching, patient and precise and faintly dry in a way that the students responded to without always being able to say why. Ruthie, the one Gus had identified in March, was spending extra hours in the barn on Wednesday afternoons, working through the avionics documentation with a focus that reminded Cassie of herself at that age, which was not always a comfortable thing to be reminded of, but was a good thing to see. Gus came less frequently, not because anything had changed between them, but because his part of the work was complete and he was, as he put it with his usual economy, getting old, and getting old meant not driving 4 hours each way for things that didn't require it. He called sometimes when she had genuine technical questions. The calls were useful and brief, and he never asked how things were going in the broad sense, because he trusted that if things weren't going well, she would say so. She appreciated this more than she knew how to express, so she didn't try, and she thought Gus understood that too. Walt was there every Sunday. He didn't negotiate about this, and she didn't ask him to. He brought his coffee and his chair and his stories, and the stories had shifted over the months from stories about Roy, specifically to stories about the world Roy had inhabited, the years of building. The things Walt had learned standing next to someone whose mind worked differently than his. The education that came from loving someone you couldn't fully follow. He was slower now. The tiredness in him was the other kind, not the tiredness of a hard week. She noticed it and said nothing because he hadn't asked her to say anything, and because the thing he was managing was his own, and he was managing it with the same dignified stubbornness he'd brought to everything else. She just made sure the folding chair was always in the same spot, made sure the coffee was always ready when he arrived. Small things. The kind of things you did when words were the wrong size for what you meant. On a Sunday afternoon in June, near the end of the day when most people had gone, and Danny was finishing up, and the barn was settling into its evening quiet, Walt stood up from his chair. He did it carefully. He walked over to Iron Moth and stood in front of her for a while. Cassie watched him from across the barn without making it obvious she was watching. He put his hand on the fuselage. Flat. The same gesture she had made the first day, in the gravel lot, when the flatbed driver had set Iron Moth down, and the whole town had watched and not said anything. He stood there with his hand on the metal and he said something, very quietly. She couldn't hear the words. She wasn't meant to. She looked away. Gave him the moment. He came back to the workbench afterward and finished his coffee and talked about a county fair he'd been to years ago and a truck he'd owned in the 70s that had been genuinely unreliable, and which he remained, he admitted, inexplicably fond of. She talked back. Danny sat on the workbench eating a granola bar and contributed when it seemed useful. When Walt left that evening, he stopped at the barn door and looked back. She looks like she always knew she was going to make it, he said. Cassie looked at Iron Moth in the evening light. The navy paint, the silver stripe, the words stenciled beneath the registration number in her own handwriting, direction isn't always forward. Maybe she did, Cassie said. Walt smiled, went out to his truck. She listened to his engine catch and the tires on the gravel, and then the sound of it going down the road and getting smaller until it was just the road and the evening birds and the radio in the corner of the barn playing something old and unhurried that nobody needed to name. She put Helen's letter in the flight log that night, tucked it between the last page of Roy's entries and the inside back cover, which was the right place, the completion of the record. She read it once, sitting at the kitchen table, the house quiet around her. Roy's voice was the same voice she'd come to know from months of reading his annotations and his flight notes, but stripped of technical precision. Just a man in a specific August, trying to say something he'd been saying around and around for years without quite landing at the center of it. In the last paragraph he'd written, "I keep thinking about the day I drove out to the field. I stood there for an hour. I couldn't bring myself to knock on any door, because I didn't know if I was coming with something worth offering, or just with everything I couldn't fix. Maybe those are the same thing. I don't know. I'm not good at knowing the difference between the two. She sat with that for a while. Then she put the letter in the flight log, and the flight log on the shelf above the workbench, next to Roy's technical drawings, and the photograph Helen had given her, and the small framed print Danny had made from a photo he'd taken on flight test day. Iron moth in the March morning light. The silver stripe on the tail boom. The words beneath the registration number. She looked at all of it for a moment. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Danny turned 18 in July. He'd been 18 for approximately 3 weeks when he sat for his FAA ground school written exam at the testing center in Missoula. He drove himself there and drove himself back and texted Cassie one word when it was done: pass. She was in the middle of a maintenance check when the text came through. She read it, set the phone down, picked it up again. Type back. Good. Then, after a moment, typed, Gus is going to want to know. Then, after another moment, I'm proud of you. She sent it before she could think about it too long. He didn't reply to that last part. But when he came in the next morning, he was 2 minutes early, which for Danny was the equivalent of a speech. Gus drove up from Wyoming for the occasion of Danny's certificate. He didn't announce he was coming. He simply appeared on a Saturday morning in late July, thermos in hand, and sat in his folding chair and watched Danny run the morning session with the same steady attention he brought to everything. At the end, he called Danny over. She didn't hear what Gus said. It was brief. Danny listened with his hands at his sides and his chin up in the way he'd learned to receive information that mattered. Then Gus nodded. Danny nodded. Gus went back to his chair. She asked Danny about it later. He said Roy Deacon would have liked knowing his aircraft was being maintained by someone who understood it properly, Danny said. He was quiet for a moment. That's the best thing anyone's ever said to me. She believed him. On a morning in late August early, before the Saturday started, before Danny arrived, she was alone in the barn, doing a routine systems check. Checking each item on the list the way she always checked each item. Not faster on the familiar ones. Not slower on the ones she liked. Just through it, item by item, the way the work was meant to be done. She heard a sound from the barn door. Looked up. A girl. 13, maybe 14. Standing in the doorway with a backpack over one shoulder, and the expression of someone who had made a decision and was currently assessing the decision from the inside. She had her mother's practical face, or her grandmother's, the kind of face that came from generations of women who had figured things out for themselves, because waiting for someone to figure things out for you was a luxury they hadn't been offered. Is this where the mechanical stuff happens? The girl said. Yes, Cassie said. The girl stepped inside. She looked at Iron Moth, the way people looked at Iron Moth the first time, that first full look, the one that took in the navy paint and the silver stripe, and the words on the tail boom, and the simple fact of a helicopter in a barn in Montana, and tried to make sense of all of it at once. My brother says women don't do that kind of thing, the girl said. Cassie set down her wrench. She walked to the corner and picked up the push broom. Walked back, held it out. The girl took it, looked at it, looked at Cassie. This is where everyone starts. This is where everyone starts. The girl looked at the broom again, then at Iron Moth, then at the tools on the workbench, and the flight log on the shelf, and the photograph on the wall and the words stenciled on the tail boom that she was close enough now to read. Direction isn't always forward. She read it twice. Cassie watched her read it. What does that mean? The girl said. Cassie thought about it for a moment. Thought about Roy driving a stake into a field on his worst day. Thought about a tin box in a cockpit wall waiting 32 years for the right hands. Thought about a notebook with one word in it, crossed out and replaced with another. It means sometimes you go back to something, she said, before you can go anywhere new. The girl considered this. Nodded, slowly, the nod of someone filing something away for later. Then she turned and started sweeping. She started at the far end of the barn and worked toward the door, the way Danny had done it on his first day, and the way Cassie suspected every person who would come after her would do it, moving carefully around the base of the helicopter without touching anything they hadn't been told they could touch. Cassie watched her for a moment. Then she went back to her checklist. The morning light came through the gaps in the barn, siding the way it always did, falling across the navy paint, and the silver stripe, and the workbench where Roy's drawings were rolled and stored, and the shelf where the flight log held everything it held. The radio played in the corner, the same station, the same unhurried frequency her father had listened to for 30 years. Iron Moth stood in the middle of it all, patient, ready, held together by months of careful work and one woman's refusal to walk away from a thing just because everyone else had. Outside, the August sky over Gravel Creek was the deep, clear blue that only came in late summer, the blue that made you understand why people stayed in places like this even when staying was hard. 12 miles east, in a field at the edge of the Voss property, a brass compass sat in the notch of an oak root beside a small rust-colored stake, and a folded letter was tucked under its base, and nobody passing by would know what any of it meant. Roy Deacon had come as far as he could. He'd marked the ground to prove it. And then someone had found the mark.